I wish to share some ideas concerning the stage of adolescence, which runs from about age 12 to 18, with particular attention to early adolescence or puberty, which runs from about age 12 to 15 or 16. Characteristics of the teenage culture have been described by many observers. For example, one noted thinker wrote the following: "The young are prone to desire and ready to carry any desire they may have formed into action. Of bodily desires, it is the sexual to which they are most disposed to give way, and in regard to sexual desire, they exercise no self-restraint. They are changed, too, and fickle in their desires, which are transitory as well as vehement. They are passionate, irascible, and apt to be carried away by their impulses. They have high aspirations, for they have never been humiliated by the experience of life, but are unacquainted with the limiting forces of circumstances. Again, in their actions, they prefer honor to expediency. If the young commit a fault, it is always on the side of excess and exaggeration. They regard themselves as omniscient and are positive in their assertions. This is, in fact, the reason of their carrying everything too far." Does this sound familiar? Would you believe that this observation of the behavior of youth was made over 2,300 years ago? The author was Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who lived from 384 to 322 BC. He was giving a treatise on the various types of character, which he listed as youth, the prime of life, and old age. In our day, Erickson identified 8 ages in the life of man. As the individual passes through each stage of development, he is faced with a master problem, which is revealed as a dilemma. As you recall, the dilemma facing the school-age child was acquiring a sense of industry while at the same time fending off a sense of inferiority. Erickson referred to adolescence as the stage of identity versus role confusion. That is, the master problem facing the person is to acquire a sense of identity while overcoming a sense of identity diffusion. The question is, who am I? The individual's progress from childhood to adulthood is readily seen in the physical changes or growth. There are important social changes accompanying the physical growth. At first, the child is totally dependent upon, both physically and economically, upon the parents. Gradually, his role changes so that he comes to be to the point of living independently. He earns a living. He marries. He establishes his own family. In adolescence, the individual moves out of childhood to the edge of the adult universe. He occupies a marginal role between being a child and growing up. In primitive societies, admittance to the adult society is granted in a formal manner by various initiation rituals. These formal initiation rites are the means of demonstrating to the community and to the child himself that he is socially as well as physically accepted as an adult. These ceremonies are traditional. Their meaning is clear to all members of the community. Here we have a picture of a portion of a ceremony of a native group of Brazil. Girls celebrate their puberty in colorful, formal dances, and the entire tribe recognizes their new status as a young woman and no longer a child. In our urbanized society, there remain few such rituals or ceremonies which are recognized by the whole community as special marks of the various stages of development. In certain religious groups, the First Communion and the Bar Mitzvah announce the child's new status to the members of a particular group. They give the child a sense of identity with that group whose members have all had similar experiences. In our secular society, the first time at school is an initiation shared by all children. It takes place at much the same age and in the same form. Graduation ceremonies mark the stage when some individuals leave the school environment to work and earn a living. The graduation exercises for others marks the stage when they begin college work. It's interesting that the graduation exercises are also identified as commencement exercises. In the early days of our society, the colonial era, the period of transition from childhood to adulthood was relatively short. The period of formal education was not at all as extensive as it is today. When a boy became old enough to work, he did a man's work. If he wanted to be a dentist, then he worked for a dentist who was a preceptor. In our contemporary society, a young person is kept waiting for acceptance into adult life until several years after puberty has been finished. Since he is kept suspended uneasily between childhood and adulthood, it is not surprising that a teenage culture has developed. Several years ago, a writer was delineating the various reasons for the growth of beards and mustaches and long hair. Such reasons were identification with a peer group or perhaps some evidence of masculinity. At one point, he thought that this trend may represent a protest to the establishment. And then he commented that earlier in the history of our country, the youth shaved were clean shaven as a protest to the establishment of that day. When a child moves into puberty, he is somewhat like a person in a canoe who suddenly finds himself in the rapids. All his energies are needed to keep the canoe from capsizing. He has little time to think about anyone else. In a large measure, the youth is the victim of biological forces he doesn't comprehend. While he has more awareness than he had as a young child, he still does not completely understand himself very well. The body is the base from which we operate. With the advent of puberty, body growth is accelerated and does not occur evenly for all parts of the body, nor does it occur evenly among persons of the same age. And so the boy or girl has come to take his body for granted up to this point, but now his body is changing. So does his body image. So does his self-image. The change is accompanied by doubts and concerns about himself. Two boys, James and Joe, cousins and close friends, were of the same age and in the same grade. When they entered the fifth grade at age 11, James experienced a sudden growth spurt, so that when they were in the sixth grade, he was much larger than any of the other boys in the class. Big feet, big hands, awkward. He was the object of much teasing. Interestingly, his voice did not change very much right at that point, and it was sort of incongruous to hear the boyish voice coming out of such a big body. Joe was slower to change. He never did attain the size of most of the boys of his age. 2 years later, when he was in high school and very eager to make a football team, he took up weightlifting to increase his size. On a Saturday morning in October, when they were in the sixth grade, I was in the classroom grading papers, and I became aware of their conversation as they sat on the steps outside the room. They were engaged in a very solemn discussion in a kind of hush-hush voice. It seems that they had watched the football game Friday afternoon, and after the game they followed the team into the shower and dressing room. A halfback, who was a senior, about 18 years of age, generally considered as being a little wild, bragged about his prowess with the girls. And then he said that he hadn't screwed a woman in so long that he was afraid he was going to shrivel up. So here we have these two boys, ages 12, who are wondering if this could really happen. In early pubescence, the individual is not so much concerned with intimate heterosexual relations as with other facets of life. But he knows he will grow into adolescence, and he wonders and perhaps worries. I have a picture drawn by a 12-year-old girl who was an avid thumbsucker. The picture depicts 4 people, 2 boys and 2 girls. There is no doubt of their sex. She identified herself as the larger girl with the blonde hair. Now, she could hardly wait until she could have dates, go to parties, go to dances, and kiss a boy in the back seat. She felt considerable frustration because her parents were holding her back. They said that she should not start having dates until she was about 16 years of age. Well, mothers sometimes become exasperated with youngsters who become self-centered, whereas the youngster has always been or has been somewhat other-centered prior to that time. It may be that with all the changes he is experiencing, he is like the person in the canoe. It is developmentally necessary for him to focus his attention on himself in order to reestablish his body image, his self-image. In our societies tend to create ideal physical types. In our society, the ideal male is broad-shouldered and muscular, athletic. The so-called mesomorphic. One wonders, however, with the present prominence of the ectomorphic rock idols, if the ideal may be changing somewhat. Ideals for women accentuate curves somewhere between the athletic mesomorph and the long-limbed ectomorph. Skinny ectomorphic boys like Joe spend hours weightlifting in vain efforts to turn themselves into big athletic men. Pudgy endomorphic girls desperately starve themselves to look slender. Many a boy has to come to terms with the fact that he will be short for the rest of his life. And the girl has to come to terms with the fact that her breasts will always be small, however much she may try to alter the fact. Thus, the agonies of self-appraisal are intensified by the growing realization that the changes are taking place are final. You know, ordinary folk sayings have much truth in them. Erickson found an inscription in a Western bar which aptly characterizes this stage. I ain't what I ought to be. I ain't what I'm going to be. But I ain't what I was. Perhaps because of the hormonal changes of puberty, the young person has an enriched capacity for emotional experience. He experiences emotions of a new depth and strangeness. He thinks about death. He realizes all kinds of new ideas, insight, which are hard to communicate. This may make him feel lonely. He forms ideas of service and develops moral fervor and zeal. He may feel guilty, and this may motivate him to a religious conversion. He is apt to see his parents, or adults, in general in a new light. He may become disgusted with what he sees as hypocrisy and impatiently turns away from the parents or adults. Some years ago, I read an article in a newspaper which made a strong impression upon me because I had experienced thoughts and feelings that were comparable to those described by the article. The writer was a young adult, a parent, and he said, "When I was a small boy, my father was all-knowing, omnipotent. He could fix anything. He could do anything. Later, I saw him as an old fuddy-duddy. He didn't know anything, and he was simply not with it. Now that I'm an adult and have a small child of my own, I look back and I see him in a different light. I see him more correctly for what he really was. I wish he were here now so that I could tell him how wise he was." Parents and teachers find this stage very, very trying with all the extraordinary swings of feelings, self-centeredness, competition, oppositional behavior. The teenager needs parents who can keep a perspective about the developmental ups and downs. Understanding parents try to remain cool and tolerant and good-humored because they realize that this is a phase a child has to experience. They treat him seriously. They do not treat him as if he were going through a phase. Can you think of anything which will alienate a teenager more than to have his thoughts and feelings treated lightly because he is, quotes, going through a stage? Parents are perhaps seldom more needed by their children than at puberty and afterward. The parental role, however, changes. They now have to learn the art of treating their children as adults, not because they are adults, but in order to help them become adults. The adolescent needs the protection of the child and the freedom of the adult so that he can become an adult. It is very important for the developing personality to acquire realistic and healthy attitudes toward his body. Some people go through life feeling ashamed of their bodies. They are concerned. They kind of hide themselves. They're very uncomfortable. There are others who admire themselves so much they cannot bear the signs of old age or competition by others. Many of these attitudes have their beginnings in the stage of puberty. Unfortunately, there are parents who become so absorbed with their social ideals that they resent the failure of the child to be beautiful or strong or athletic. And the child's self-confidence is undermined and may be deeply injured along with his self-image and his self-esteem. Other parents, equally at fault, are forever showing off their children as beautiful or strong. And all the while, the child would like to crawl in a hole. Parenting is not easy, nor is pubescence. In closing, I'd like to relate the situation of a child age 14 undergoing orthodontic treatment. Her orthodontic problem was not much of an aesthetic problem. It was essentially a functional problem. Orthodontic treatment was started and seemed to be going along rather well. But in the summer, she did not wear her headgear consistently, so that the teeth drifted, and there was potentially a worse problem than before orthodontics was begun. An evaluation indicated that she now needed to have 2 teeth extracted. But she rebelled. What to do? An interview with the girl disclosed that some very pertinent information. She had never really wanted orthodontics. It was her mother's idea. Her father had never been enthusiastic about the program. And we read into what she was saying that by his very passive position, he was in effect supporting the child against the mother. We also learned that she had some vague fears about surgery, something about an aunt who was said to have died in a dental chair. The graduate student and the faculty held a staffing conference, and it was agreed that it was learned that the father had never really been seen, nor had he ever really been directly consulted. So it was decided that the student would try to make an appointment with the father for a conference in the father's own domain, in his own home. The student would be in the role of an uninvited guest, so to speak, a rather awkward position. The expressed purpose of the visit was to evaluate the orthodontic treatment up to this point and decide upon next steps. Nothing was said that was critical of the family or of the child's behavior. Nothing was said of the need for extraction of 2 teeth, just to evaluate the situation and then to plan the next steps. Well, the father reluctantly agreed. He was a salesman. He was the kind of guy who wore dark glasses, even at home in the room. Smoked a cigar, the sort of guy you would expect to say, well, what's up, Doc? After a few minutes of introductions, the student Pat brought out the original x-rays, the original study models, and then the subsequent x-rays and models. Soon the father had the child sitting on the floor at his feet so that he could compare the x-rays and the models with the condition of her mouth at that point. And then he said that it looked like to him that the teeth were just too crowded and that they'd have to take out some of them. Well, Pat said that that was one of the reasons that he'd come to see what they would think would be the best thing to do. Well, the father was really behind this plan, and he was disappointed that Pat himself could not extract the teeth the next day. Treatment then proceeded uneventfully. Now, we learned a number of things from this case. We learned something about communication and lags in communication, misunderstandings that grow out of lack of communication. We learned about family behavior. Eric Byrne would call it games people play. Relative to puberty or adolescence, we observed an interesting phenomenon. When boys and girls enter puberty, their affections are usually limited to members of the family and to members of the same sex. Boys then suddenly become more protective of mothers, while girls go through a period of flirting with daddy. In this case, daddy was taken in by his daughter, and mother was on the periphery. When daddy really became aware of the nature of the double problem, he asserted himself, and the girl fell into line. During this age, many youngsters, both male and female, tend to identify with the dentist, the orthodontist particularly, and the dentist who is perceptive and stable can have an enduring impact upon the child. Many dental students become motivated toward dentistry by reason of the meaningful relationship they have during this period. In summary, puberty and adolescence are seen as a period when the individual develops a sense of who he is, what he is like, what he can do. It is a period of physical growth accompanied by emotional stresses. As the individual gropes his way through his many and often opposing thoughts and ideas and mixed feelings, confusion as to what he is and what he'll become, it is at once a frustrating and a fascinating experience. The process occurs to all of us. It can be a rewarding experience for the adult who can perceive the adolescent for what he really is. More about this when we consider communication or behavior is communication.